Hola Mathews, welcome to TED. This is a show that answers and tearing down the big question, why education? Today's show is no different. We engage you with an amazing guest who's an entrepreneur, the CEO of To Enable, a company that does content development, production, e-learning, and ICTs and hardware supplies. Sit back and relax, but at the same time, interact with us on our socials. Right, guys, thank you for joining us on the TED Show. Today, as promised, we are chatting to Mike Mathews, who is the founder of To Enable. Mike, thank you for joining us. Could you please tell us a little bit about how you grew up?
Yes, sure, Abram. I was born and I grew up in Johannesburg. I lived out north, and in those days it was fairly rural. So I have vivid memories of riding a horse when I was younger, and I went to a fairly good school, and which offered obviously great education and a whole lot of extracurricular activities. And from there I went to university in Cape Town and studied engineering, got a BSc in engineering.
Sure. Did that strike up some passion in you for education? Were you always passionate about education, or it's something that just came up?
So, no, that didn't actually. So what I ended up doing after that was going and basing myself in the Middle East, and I started a business which was renting out equipment and people to cover news stories in the Middle East. So I spent a lot of time traveling around places such as Lebanon, Syria, Iran. I came to Africa, did the Mandela release, and that was probably a very important learning period for me. I was exposed to a lot of stuff which people aren't normally exposed to. And then on returning to South Africa, I obviously, coming back, you come back with a renewed passion. And one of the ideas then was to try and work out how to make the biggest impact one could. At the time, my daughters were at school down in Mpumalanga, and I was involved on the school board, and I became very passionate about trying to make changes. I had a couple of focuses. The one focus was music, and the other focus was obviously social upliftment. I also had an environmental bias, so I built a house at the time, and it won one of those AfriSam awards. I didn't mean to win it; it was by accident. But through that, the issue became how does one actually deliver this improve education in schools? And being in Mpumalanga and working in typically rural townships, we started a music program called Casterbridge Music Development Academy. The issue became how do we actually deliver education into these places that we were working? Because we were very aware of the poor standards of education in underserved schools. And I had a very strong IT background, and I had a good relationship with an IT company, and they built us an application to help us deliver music into these areas. So we had music theory and a couple of other courses. And we were able to set up computer centers in our hubs, and we used like a 3G dongle in those days to provide internet access. And we encountered the problems that we are still faced today, which was how do you deliver video into a center which has poor internet. So one of the features of To Enable is that it can actually run offline. And that was born out of that experience, was how do we allow users in a computer center sitting in, for instance, Kabakweni to be able to access videos without all the latency issues. So we overcame that, and we did that by hosting a lot of the videos locally. And so that was where the motivation for To Enable began. What really changed it was I did a presentation in terms of trying to fundraise for the Casterbridge Music Development Academy. It was a music program which is very, very difficult to raise money for, because obviously all the emphasis in terms of people giving money to non-profits tends to focus on important things. So,
Yes.
the Gates Foundation might be HIV/AIDS. Businesses tend to focus on things which pique their particular interest. And music is really supported by very few organizations. So we then added math, science, and English to it, because one of the big problems in terms of our understanding of why we were getting poor results in education was that if the instruction is in English, and if English was weak, then you can't really study any other subject. So that was the motivation for those three subjects. The maths and the sciences, obviously everybody talks about maths and science. It's just like the fallback position for anybody who wants to talk about education.
Yeah.
So we loaded those subjects on the platform, and then we offered those. And I employed a few teachers to align content with the curriculum, and we delivered content in, in those three subjects. And then at the fundraising event, the Department of Education here in Mpumalanga saw it, and they got really excited by this idea of being able to deliver content into schools around Mpumalanga, and they asked us, and they entered into an MOU to develop content in the major enrollment subjects. So we then employed 15 teachers, and we spent a year aligning content as much as we could in the major enrollment subjects. And that's how we ended up with a library of content which was aligned with the curriculum. And that must have been in about 2015. And then
amazing.
Things really didn't transpire digitally after that for a while, but we can talk about that later. But that was where my interest in education began, and it came obliquely. So it came through obviously having a different view of the world, having traveled overseas and worked in the Middle East covering news events, realizing the major social issues that were at play globally, then coming back to South Africa and being acutely aware of what was happening in South Africa, and then trying to make a positive impact in terms of using my skills to try and address something which I thought was really important to address.
That's really amazing. Very rich history from where To Enable started. And I must say that I think you kind of saw where the future is looking like for the world moving into the fourth industrial revolution. And with the hopes and what you've seen already experienced and what you envision, how do you think To Enable can revolutionize the education system of South Africa going forward?
That is an exceptionally difficult question to answer because it's not a homogeneous space. So there's not like a single solution will fit everything.
Yeah.
So my my experience has taught me to see things slightly differently, and I'm one of those people who approaches problems probably from the wrong direction. So the initial idea was that if we provided good quality resources into schools, they would grab them and it would make a significant difference immediately. And that was our belief in terms of that these schools were under-resourced, and we could certainly make that change. The other thing was that students who wanted to have access to curriculum-aligned resources, if they've got a poor teacher, so often in some of these schools you've got teachers teaching subjects for which they weren't trained because they just lacked the staff or the capacity. So the idea was that if you had a really inquiring or curious student, that they could then access these videos, which they wouldn't normally be able to access because they don't have data. They would be able to access these videos in an attempt to support their learning. So that was the motivation. What I've subsequently learned is that I think my approach to the problem was wrong. And I've also learned that there are many different needs in terms of the types of school. So the first part that I believe I was wrong in was that I thought that there was a demand for education by children. So there are some, but I think we forget how important schools are for socializing and for interacting with your peers. And I think if I recall back at my school years, I really enjoyed my sport and I enjoyed being with my friends. The academic part of it was just part of the duty of going to school. And so the academic desire wasn't really there until much later, maybe in grade 10, grade 11, when you started to see the need for it. So if you fail to really have instilled that desire in a student by grade 10, it's going to be really almost impossible to instill it in them at all. And the person that I think is there's obviously many people that are responsible for it, but the one person that I think is really underestimated in this whole scheme of things is are the parents, and specifically the mother.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is we were looking to start up a full-time school, and then use To Enable as a teaching aid within the school, so we could then implement a way of how you could use digital or integrate digital tools into classrooms. And I met with a couple of Canadian professors, and they said, if you really want a good school, there are two questions you need to ask. And you're going to have to forgive me, but the first one is, are the parents still together? And does the mother have a college degree? So it's not anything about the parents being together. It's about, does the child come from a stable household?
Yeah.
Is the household, are there proper role models in the household? So that is an important aspect, is that if you're in a safe home environment and an inspirational home environment, that's an important place to begin in terms of a student wanting to get an education. And the second thing is, does the mother have a college degree? Is really, that means, does the mother understand the value of an education? Because if she's got a college degree, she probably has had a great job, and she probably understands that she only got that job through having a good qualification. So she tends to be the motivator for good education in children. So if you were a child and you came home to a mom who had super high standards for you, and you presented her with a fail for mathematics, she would probably reprimand you to begin with, and then she would start to speak to the teacher, and she would organize extra lessons, and then she would go to the headmaster, and if she believed that the school was fundamentally not serving you, she would actually arrange to move her house into an area where there was a better school. And this does happen, in households where the parents play an important role in the child's formative years.
I really like that, Mark. I really like that, especially because you're shifting the paradigm where a lot of people always think you need to target the kids, you need to create content for the kids. And yet, if you can sell it to the parents, the teachers support each other with the parents, and communities also come in and they play a big role in that.
Yeah. So that's why I was saying that my approach was not right. The problem of education is now, what I believe, and it's my opinion, is that it's far greater than just simply providing textbooks and materials to teachers. If there's only so many textbooks you can provide a teacher, and they will probably, if you give them 10, they will still only use one. So burdening them with even more content is not necessarily going to be the solution. So yes, it's an interesting space. But I think the parents are completely, they don't really even form part of the equation. So taking that even a bit further, I think mothers that are really proactive in their children's education already have their kids in schools that are functioning. So, formal Model C schools, or, maybe private schools, and I'm not promoting private schools, but they will have made a decision to put their child in a school where the child is getting better marks, and where they can play a role in the results of the children.
Yeah.
And then you have a flip side, which is moms which probably, don't, and that's a broad space, because when I say that, it could be child-headed households, in which case there's not even a mother. There are other households which are headed by the grandmother. Certainly in this country, where grandmothers lived through apartheid, definitely, they don't or unlikely have a great education. So they just are keen and happy that their children go to school, and they're not demanding the great education, standards of education. So if their child comes back with a 40% for mathematics, they're not going to start seeing the headmaster and choosing another school. And this is one of the difficult spaces that we need to operate, which we're trying to operate in. So saying that a product like To Enable is going to transform that space is a very brave statement. I think there's so many other pressures that are at play. It would be wonderful if To Enable could.
Yes.
And I think one of the conversations is how one could use digital materials in a classroom. But I think there's a lot of things that need to be addressed before before something like To Enable or another textbook or another intervention in terms of handing something to somebody to make use of, which is likely to transform them, is, we need to move beyond that. The shift needs to happen that the child, and supported by their parents, are hungry for an improvement in their lives. And I think if you can pivot that, then I think tools like To Enable and textbooks come into their own.
I fully agree with you, Mike. It's a very powerful statement that you're making, and also it's a call to all the partners that even To Enable works with. I think there's another notion that you just touched on, the issue of access, because it's the biggest crisis in our country, that we want to reach so many communities and learners and parents through our resources. However, we still have the biggest issue, access. And COVID-19 has really pushed and accelerated so many things to be done swiftly, but still they're not far-reaching to other communities, rural areas that we deal with. What is To Enable doing to ensure that resources get to even the most impoverished communities and learners have access to these quality resources?
So recently we've just partnered with MTN, so we've rebranded the To Enable platform MTN, and MTN has zero-rated it. So users on the MTN network can get access to these resources. We've also changed the configuration that users can download content to their devices. So, and we need to have a conversation around devices. But if you've got a device which has got spare memory, you can download the videos in whatever subject and grade you want using the mobile app. I'm not talking about the website. And that allows useful access offline. And if it can be done over the MTN network, and MTN has provided 2 gigabytes of free data to every user every month, which will provide them access to certainly many videos. That has improved the access. But there needs to be a conversation around the devices and the connectivity, as you rightly say, because the connectivity has always been a big problem, and it is going to be a big problem for a long time. Obviously there's a rollout, and if you're in the major centers or the larger towns, you get better access. But in the communities that we're talking about, there is very poor access. So one of the things is, obviously learners aren't really allowed, or in many schools, they're not allowed to take devices to school.
Yes.
So providing for instance, we could put what we call a CAP or a hub in a school where learners can connect and download the content for free over the Wi-Fi network. The fact that they're not allowed to take devices to school means that they can't access that content. So that in itself is a massive barrier. And there are legitimate reasons why they don't want learners to have devices at school. You don't want them stolen, and you don't want the distraction, and there are many reasons. But there's also a very compelling reason to say we should allow learners to have devices, and they should be able to bring their own device, and they should be able to access the content that the school is providing. So the school then becomes a repository of learning material and content, which learners can use whatever device or method they want in order to access that information.
Sure.
So one of the things we tried, and we piloted in Bushbuck Ridge, which worked quite well, was we understood that there were these issues, but we partnered with a specific school, and we tried to get teachers to use the resources in their lessons. So certainly I think teachers are pivotal in education. And one of the difficult things for teachers is, how do you make your classes interesting? And in rural spaces, it's difficult to get access to good resources. So the idea was that we could provide them videos, and we could provide them some resources. And in their normal lesson, they could, for instance, play a video which would explain a specific concept. And that in itself would just change the dynamic slightly within the classroom. It would make it slightly richer than just simply a chalk and talk process. So that worked so long as we provided the computer and video projector, and we came in and we set up the screen and we made everything like that available. So even just providing one person within the classroom, which would be the teacher, the tools to be able to use the resources in the classroom is in itself a big project, because you've got to now equip every class with a screen and a video projector, and now we're talking about electricity and backup generators, because we've been through phases of load shedding, and then the security, and so it doesn't just become a matter of let's provide you good resources. It becomes a matter of how do we provide the infrastructure, and
Yes.
that becomes a huge task.
Yes.
So certainly there are many ways that ToEnable could be used. It can be used by students directly, and with MTN, hopefully they can download content and they can access it in subjects where they are struggling. And I will couch that in the fact that I think students who are keen to learn will not use just ToEnable, they will use many resources, and that's the mindset that I think is important in a child. The other way is obviously to equip teachers in classrooms with this, and to try, to assist teachers to use these resources to maybe spruce up their lessons, and hopefully, if they can use good quality lesson material, it could even be Khan Academy, it could be the content we're creating, because in the studio that you're in at the moment is, we are creating lessons on a daily basis.
Sure.
So it could be any of that content to explain a specific concept in a class. So that would also be a useful way to use ToEnable. Obviously with COVID, which is a completely different thing, it's a curveball where children have to stay at home, you're now having to provide distance learning, so teachers, and even in the top schools, have had to have a huge cultural change, where they're sitting at home and they're now trying to provide a lesson over Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever the applications that they've used. And that is a really difficult space. A lot of people think that this is where it's going to go, but I find it hard to believe, because you lose the whole social aspect of education, and you need to socialize, and children need to socialize, and I think trying to do distance education and kids sitting in rooms alone is an absolutely horrendous concept to me. But again, that's my opinion. But so hopefully it would be great if kids could go back to school,
Yes.
and it would be great if teachers could use digital resources in their classrooms, and it would be great if kids who wanted to learn could then download resources such as the ToEnable resources and use those on their own to help them study or understand concepts. So it's a rich picture in terms of all the people that need to play a role in it.
Sure.
And certainly ToEnable is not just something you throw down and solve a problem. It's not that. Anybody who believes that is they're being naive, I think.
Yeah, I think on what you just touched on, Mike, indeed, we can never exhaust our endeavors to push the mandate of education, making sure that resources are widely available as much as we can, and people are able to choose. But at the same time, we need to carry on the conversations of education in terms of access, equality, and also, justifying and also reworking on the injustices of the past and our government coming to party, and all other parties that should come on board actually in pushing the education mandate come on board, and we all work together to make sure that we are reaching out and we are contributing towards educated with quality resources nation. But having said all of that, on Tiered Show, the reason why we have this show, Mike, is for us to also try and deal with the narrative of education, because it's unfashionable. It's not a nice thing to talk about, and every time when people think of education, they just think about someone who's at school. So the big question for you, Mike, is why education? You could be doing other things. You could be in sport, doing some fun things in your engineering and other things. But why are you creating resources and supporting educational movements and content and all these things that are happening in the education space while you could be doing other things?
So I certainly believe that's a really difficult question, because, as you say, there's just so many things that one could support. But I went down this road of trying to build an environmental house and be off grid and be sustainable, and I realized that something like that wasn't possible unless the entire community was sustainable. And then the question comes as, well, how do you make an entire community sustainable? So, to an earlier question around points around the past and the poor education that people have been provided over the many decades historically. How do you make that right? So that became an issue. There's no point in trying to build a wall. I can say like a Donald Trump thing. There's no point in building a wall around my property and keeping everybody out of my property, because whatever I can build, somebody can climb over. So the issue, there's a different approach, and I think Clem Sumner in one of his books suggested it, which is actually to take your walls down, and I would really like to see this country maybe be taxed for fences, because a fence is basically a barrier to keep people out of your place. And if you remove the fences, it improves the conversations.
Yes.
And if you improve the conversations, then it means I need to fix the issues that you are suffering, so I can, which will, in addressing what your needs are, I'm actually addressing my needs, which is a need for being in a safe and secure community, which is actually something that we all want.
Yes.
So my feeling at that time was, well, the best way to do it would be through education. So the simplest way to uplift somebody, to take them out of this idea of poverty and no opportunities, is to give them an education. But it's a very complex topic, and as I've said, I think the real thing is how do we instill in the youth an urgency to want to learn, because it needs to come from them. So, I've had children, and I'm sure many parents will agree, it's very difficult to impose upon your children exactly what they should do. They're free thinking beings on their own, and it's important that their inspiration comes from within. And when it does, your results are just so much better. They are just self-motivated, self-driven, disciplined. They suddenly see themselves in a society which they can flourish in, and that, I think, is really an important aspect of it. But still, education and creating that mindset is possibly one of the most important things in order to address the problems that we face in this country.
So true, Mike. We have a lot of socioeconomic issues that we deal with, and a lot that we need to deal with as a society, but definitely investing in education is never in vain. Thank you so much, Mike, and I truly understand when you say the question that I asked you about why education is really a broad question and a very difficult question. That's why here on Tiered, we are having this conversation with people like you who are in the education space and making a huge impact. So big ups to Enable and all other partners that are supporting education in South Africa.
Fantastic, everyone. Thank you very much for having me on your program.
Well, that's it, Bafetu, for today. Thank you so much to our awesome guest, Mr. Mathews, for also teaching us that the whole purpose of education is to empower one with information and knowledge, enabling you to use that wisely. Up until next time, make sure that you keep on interacting with us on our socials, and we'll see you soon. Bye.